Okay, this is great. I can see people. Okay, let me give you some tips for how to get the most out of this Bible study. Okay, I just have 7 points. We'll go by real quick. 1, make sure you have this is going to be a little difficult, Bible. Okay, you should have a Bible out. All right. I won't make you do what I have my students do. Hold up your Bible, for participation points. Oh, there you go. You got your Bible. All right. So make sure you have a Bible. I will be reading out of the RSVCE unless there's a word that I'm talking about and I think that it could best be translated with another word or series of words or phrases or something that, but I'll basically be working off of the RSVCE. The one that I have is the Ignatius Catholic Study Bible. It's really good. My 2 friends wrote the commentary on it, Curtis Mitch and Scott Hahn, and it's amazing. It has so many good footnotes that you can go back and reference. And so, make sure you have a good study Bible. I think the Augustine Institute is also putting out some really good stuff. And you also have Baker Press, which is also publishing the Catholic commentary on Scripture. Okay. Second thing, you should have a notebook. If you don't mark up your Bible, make sure you have some sort of notebook. Good. Make sure you have a notebook so that you can jot down either notes that I'm making or even questions that you might have for the end. That'll help. Third, remember that if I was to give you all the information that I have, again, Dave Gordon would have my head because I just finished a study on a Zoom study this summer for Timothy Flanders' organization. It went for 12 weeks and it was initially supposed to be 6 weeks, and I rushed through. That was a rush. But really should take 2 or 3 years to get through Matthew's gospel. And same with Paul. I mean, if we were to say everything that we need to say about Paul's letter to the Ephesians, it could take us longer than 7 weeks. What I hope to give you here, though, are the tools and the basic building blocks for what Paul is saying so that you can go and interpret Paul and his other letters as best you can on your own. So I will give you a lot of information, but like Augustine says in his beginning on Christian doctrine, he's like, it's best if I just gave you the tools rather than give you all the doctrines and explain all of them. Augustine says at the beginning, it's really good if I can just teach you some of the principles at first that you can apply to the study of sacred scripture. So another thing I might suggest, which sounds crazy, but it's not crazy, but you could actually read Ephesians every day. It should not take that long. If you have an audio Bible, if you can get the Bible app or a Bible app or read Ephesians on YouTube, you can get through it every single day. So if you wake up in the morning, you do your morning prayer and you click on the audio, you can listen to it by the time you're out of the shower, brushed your teeth, got ready, and you've already listened to it once. And if you do that for a week, times 7 weeks, 70 times 7, we're actually going to talk about that. It's in the Prophet Daniel, but you can get through like almost 50 times. You can get through Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And I promise you, if you read it every day, because typically what we have in the Mass is we go from we get a little bit here, and then 5 months later, we get a little bit later from the Ephesians, and it's kind of scattered, and it's good because the church ties in the Old and New Testament and the Psalms together. But it's something Catholics oftentimes don't do, which is just making a run at it from beginning to end. And that's really, really important. Okay. So get in the habit of that. You could read Matthew's gospel every day too, for 7 weeks straight. Paul's letter to the Ephesians is only 6 chapters, a little quicker. So, you can get through it every day. So that's what I would suggest. If you can't do it every day, maybe read it at least once a week so that you can become familiar with a lot of things that Paul's saying. And after you do that, you start to realize, after reading it through, for the 10th, 11th, 12th time, you're like, oh, wow, I didn't even, I missed that for the first 10 times, and then you just realize after that, you just start discovering more and more of what Paul seems to be getting at. The 5th thing is pray. This Paul would be scandalized if we were reading his text and also not allowing it to affect our lives and praying through it. So really the end goal of this, you can hear St. Bonaventure and St. Thomas Aquinas in the background saying, make sure they're praying. Theology is all about prayer. That's the end goal. So if you're taking these concepts and you're like, ooh, I can't wait to use this in a conversation, or I can't wait to think more about this, that's good insofar as it goes, but we need to pray through, as Catholics, we need to pray through what we're learning, okay? So, and actually some scholars have argued on some of the books back there, some scholars have actually argued that it seems like Paul's letter is a prayer, like from beginning to end, or at least huge chunks of it. So that's interesting. It's obviously a letter, but there are times where, yeah, Paul seems to be going into a prayer-like state. Okay. There's much that I want to say about the gospel reading today that's going to tie into a lot of what we're going to say today, but I'm going to resist. I just had to say that. So if anybody has a question about render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, you can ask me in the Q&A. And there's always more to learn, so keep learning. And okay, so that's all I have. So we're going to get into it, okay? Okay, and I want you to begin with your Bible in hand and you got your notes. I want you to begin in like the season of Advent or Christmas time, okay? So imagine it's Christmas time and several members of your family gather around the coffee table one quiet evening to solve a seasonal puzzle by the warm fire, okay? My kids love that opening line, right? Because they're like, yes, we need to, go to, it's getting closer and closer to Advent. It's getting colder, even though it's still like 90 degrees in California here. It's getting colder. And so we need to do a puzzle by the fire. Okay. But imagine that this isn't just any puzzle, however. Rather, it contains a vast quantity of pieces, colors, and shapes that you've never seen before. But as you sit by the fire, this isn't just any puzzle, okay? It contains a vast quantity of pieces and colors and shapes that you've never experienced before. And you know it can be complicated, but it's going to take some time. After pouring yourself a cup of tea, a quick glance at the fire, you embrace for what will be a challenging puzzle. Anyone who's dealt with complex puzzles before realizes that unless you constantly look up to see the big picture, you'll easily get lost in all the various cuts and shades of colors. That's sort of where one has to begin, even with smaller, less complex puzzles. A few seconds of staring up at the box, followed by a few seconds looking down at the shapes and colors of the pieces, then back up again for a few more glances back and forth at the pictures on the box and the pieces set out on the table. This back and forth is the basic head swivel of puzzle solvers everywhere. And it's no less important for those who wish to understand the books of the New Testament. I think that is one of the big challenges. I think a lot of Catholics give up precisely because you get into the text itself and you start to get lost. Where is this going? What exactly is the story we are looking at here? Where is everything going? What does the end of this whole thing actually look like? And once this is done, how do all the various chapters and verses of the Bible, especially those in the New Testament, fit together into that larger picture? Up to see the big picture, back down to see the verses, up again to see the big picture, then back down to see the verses, and on and on and on. Now, where do we go if we want to see what the big picture looks like? If we want to look at the box, the picture on the box. And there are various places we can go if one wishes to take a glance at what that big picture actually looks like. Amidst all the chapters and verses that sort of run through our Bible and we kind of get lost. Now, Revelation 21 through 22 is a classic example. A lot of people like to go to those last two chapters of the Bible to sort of see what the end is going to look like, okay? But there are other places no less important and penetrating. Enter the Apostle Paul. Paul stands before our eyes, you guys, all these centuries later, as one who painted this great landscape for the early church and can even lay claim to the title of the founder of Catholic theology. He was the church's great puzzle solver. There's no doubt that after he placed Jesus of Nazareth at the center of it, Paul found what he needed to shuffle around the pieces, flip over a few that had been left untouched, and most certainly look under the table for those which had, after centuries of twists and turns, been forgotten altogether, like Deuteronomy 32 and several others. And for those wishing to gaze upon the biblical story, the whole of it, and not just its parts, they will inevitably have to arrive at the famous letters of St. Paul. It's safe to say that Paul not only knew the task at hand, but was well prepared for it. Paul's letter to the Ephesians. It's the telling of two long narratives that come crashing headlong into one another in the middle of the 1st century AD. The main story Paul tells is one of Israel and Israel's God, a story, by the way, that is still part of the scene today. Israel lays claim to the land. Jews are claiming the land. Hamas and others are claiming it's their land. Israel is central not just to the story of what's happening in last week's headlines, but for Paul as well. The main story he is telling, and the main story the Jews today are trying to tell about their place in the land, is about Israel. Israel's God, God's promises to Israel. But Paul tells that story as a subversion of yet another story altogether, which is often overlooked and forgotten. It's the story of the Empire of Rome. There is much that will need to be said about both of these stories as we work our way through this letter. But we need to say a few things at the outset. Ready? Number one, if you're taking notes, here you go. Rome was always viewed by the early Catholics as the 4th earthly kingdom of Daniel's oracles, what we call the Danielic oracles. It was this kingdom, that of Rome, that would be destroyed and be destroyed by and replaced with God's very own kingdom. That much remained true. There are a vast amount of New Testament texts that could, at this point, be pulled together to demonstrate that Daniel's narrative is not just background noise. It's not a background image, but it is the central narrative of and the immediate context surrounding Jesus's ministry, life, death, resurrection, ascension, and everything else that followed up and into what Paul wants to say in the middle of the 60s AD to those who are living in and around Ephesus. Okay? I'm going to only mention 2 of the scriptural evidences here that Daniel is front and center. First, what is Jesus's favorite identity marker for himself? What does he call himself? He calls himself, his favorite name for himself is the Son of Man. The Son of Man. That name, though, the Son of Man, doesn't come out of nowhere, but largely from the book of Daniel. This at least is evidence that all of what Jesus was doing makes the sense it does when one encounters the meaning and history of Daniel. Second text. When it comes time for Jesus's arrest and trial, the high priest asked Jesus about the charges being brought against him, to which he turned and responded, I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Mark 14:62. What did Jesus mean by this? What did he think this meant? This is a direct allusion to Daniel's vision of the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and sitting at God's right hand. These 2 passages alone are sufficient for now to make the first general point that I'd like to make. If Daniel's vision is coming true in and through the person of Jesus and the church, Jesus, and then through his church, then Rome happened to be the final kingdom that marks the stage for the arrival of God's very own. First century Catholics took all of this for granted, even if 21st century Catholics have largely forgotten it. Second, Paul does not shy away from filling out the exact details of Daniel's vision. He has indeed woven into his letter those elements of the fourth kingdom, that is Rome, that are at one point destroyed, and yet in another sense altogether, they're picked up and refashioned around Jesus and the church. The term gospel, for example, will be used in much the same way that it was used leading up and into the first century. That is, to express the arrival of a new emperor and his kingdom, or the major victory of that emperor in battle. All of this, among other things, that as interpreters of Paul, we must do, all of this means, among other things, that as interpreters of Paul, we must do away with the current way of seeing the world in which we live. That is, as dominated by a liberal Epicurean framework that says that things like church and state operate, for the most part, in entirely separate zones of existence, never to come into contact, never to be spoken of in the same sentence. Paul, for his part, did not have the luxury of drawing this line, this nice illusory line of peace between the two. He lived in a world, he believed in a world in which modern conceptions of church over here and state over there were entirely unthinkable. Because even words like ecclesia, the word for church, functioned as the word for a civic political assembly of the state in the first century. It was a political word for a political community taken out of the world of politics. And it functioned the same in Rome as it did in Athens, largely the same. When you read these letters, that is, okay, as containing what they originally contained, that is, the kind of stuff that got Paul arrested and executed, you can begin to see why it was that Christendom not only collapsed 100 or so years ago, but why it is as well that too many laity think that their vocation amounts to a few politically vague tweets and a conversation or two about high taxes and parental rights violations and stuff. That's what we're talking about here in California a lot. Paul wrote a much more, and those are all good, but Paul wrote a much, much more dangerous letter. He had a more dangerous political vision than this, which amounted to the banner of the slain lamb. Neither donkey nor elephant, okay, nor for Paul, even the eagle of Rome, okay. He was walking around with the banner of the slain lamb, and he went to Rome with that banner, okay. And I understand that this can be a lot for someone to think of the church being more political, of Catholics returning to a Christendom-like, involvement in politics. And if one feels even a hint of anxiety, Chris, where do you think you're going with all of this? Are you saying what I think you're saying? This isn't how it works, Chris. We live in a united system of states that makes it impossible for Christ to become king. We don't even live in a kingdom anymore. So it's just weird to even mention a king. We're in a democracy, a constitutional republic, or whatever it is we're in anymore. And plus, the gospel is just about going to heaven when we die. So why bring in politics? If all of this is sort of causing you anxiety at the thought of being involved in politics under the banner or name of Christ, then you've at least felt a small dose of what it would have been like to read any one of Paul's letters that claims Jesus is Lord. If reading these letters for all they're worth causes your heart to race, then I promise you'll be a better biblical interpreter for it. All of this is to say that the story these early Catholics were living in was a world at the brink of cosmic war, a war between, as they put it, two distinct ages. Paul will talk about this. redefined around two very different lords, Jesus Kyrios, okay, Jesus is Lord, or Kaiser Kyrios. Bishop Barron talks about this a lot, or he used to a lot. These were ages which were marked by moral combat. Those in the new age paying taxes with faith, pistis, to Jesus, while those in the passing age paying allegiance with the taxes of sin. We know from all that Paul says in his various letters that he himself is a man situated in the midst of this battle, having swapped sides dramatically in the middle of the battle, and is now walking around claiming to be an ambassador of the world's true emperor. To begin to grasp what all of this meant, what this ambassadorship meant, we need to take a step back to consider, however briefly, Paul's own story. Who is this guy? Paul didn't grow up in Jerusalem. He was a Jew living outside of the land promised to his fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. For Paul, this meant several things at once. It meant that the more familiar he became with the way of the world conquered by Rome, the sense of exile increased with the increased strength status of the empire itself. It was less and less feasible, you guys, that Israel's exile, at least in Paul's mind, would end by any human means. God would have to do something new and dramatic. He was aware, maybe even more than most Jews at the time, of the sovereignty that was not yet Yahweh's. This allowed Paul to take in a bit more, perhaps even a lot more, of the Greco-Roman world in which non-Jews were living. What did they think? How did they act? What did they pray for? Who did they pray to? And most importantly, what was their view of history? The answers Paul gathers to himself while living outside of Jerusalem under the mind of Rome would be of good use, as we'll see, to the one God of Israel. But we also know that Paul lived just north of Jerusalem, not far from the city itself, in Cilicia's capital of Tarsus. He is Paul of Tarsus, or Saul of Tarsus. So although part of the diaspora, that is Jews that are living outside of Judah, right, or the land promised to Israel, Paul had occasion to travel to Jerusalem for formal training as a Pharisee. If we can imagine for a moment, and this is really important before we get into the texts of Paul, if we can imagine for a moment the two stories told of the world that we are living in as modern American Catholics. I realize there are probably some of you that don't live in America. I forget that, Church Militant probably has a reach that's, worldwide. So, but I'm assuming that I'm talking to mainly Americans. But if we can imagine for a moment the two stories told of the world we are living in as modern American Catholics, we could quite possibly begin to grasp the complexity of the world Paul himself was living in. Okay, here's what I mean. On the one hand, there is the story of American independence and sovereignty. Okay, the founders of our great nation announced a novus ordo secularum and made sure to stamp it on our dollar bills and silver coins. That is, of a whole new order of the ages, a new age, no less, in which America's founding had ushered in a peace, which, after the Civil War, was more and more expressive of America's exceptionalism, summarized in the interesting phrase, Pax Americana, the American peace. Here is how one American foreign policy professor at Johns Hopkins described it in 1997. Listen to this. In contrast to previous empires, the scope and pervasiveness of American global power today are unique. Not only does the United States control all the world's oceans, its military legions are firmly perched on the western and eastern extremities of Eurasia. American vassals and tributaries, some yearning to be embraced by even more formal ties to Washington, dot the entire Eurasian continent. American global supremacy is buttressed by an elaborate system of alliances and coalitions that literally span the globe, close quote. Expanding this peace throughout North America and beyond, many thinkers today believe it is, and this is really important, America's divine-like destiny to police the world and bring peace among the nations. However ironic their origins might seem when placed alongside each other, there are certain images, and American Catholics will know this, that have been brought to bear on this divine-like destiny. A city set on a hill from Matthew 5:14. Americans have heard about that. Or images of the eagle, the American eagle, which is the eagle of Rome, flying with his wings outstretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, all of which gave Americans and still give Americans today a purpose of our place in the world. Already in 1894, the Forum would issue this statement. Listen to this. The true cause for exaltation is the universal outburst of patriotism in support of the prompt and courageous action of President Cleveland in maintaining the supremacy of law throughout the length and breadth of the land, in establishing the Pax Americana. Close quote. But what would happen in 1945 with the end of the Second World War, when America, having come out 2-0 in World War victories, suddenly felt itself the center of new representative forms of government arising from the ashes, not least the organization called the United Nations, taking up residence on 405 East 45th Street, New York, New York. What did all this mean for America's manifest destiny? What does it still mean? The nations will be united, this seems to suggest, and America would be at the heart of it. What was called the Pax Britannica had collapsed during the outbreak of the First World War and had now given way to the Pax Americana. The American empire now rules the world, brings peace. This is what Woodrow Wilson said as to why America would involve itself in the Second World War. To vindicate the principles of peace and justice in the life of the world, he said, as against selfish and autocratic power, and to set up amongst the really free and self-governed people of the world such a concert of purpose and of action will henceforth ensure the observance of those principles. Close quote. No doubt, Americans have always, and we see it today, have always fluctuated back and forth between go help Israel or don't go help Israel. Go help Ukraine, don't help Ukraine. Okay. Americans have always fluctuated back and forth between imperialist and isolationist tendencies. Should we police the world or should we not? Already in 1960, President John F. Kennedy was resisting the Pax Americana, common in his own day, that argued that America's involvement in Vietnam amounted to a new kind of imperialism. Quote, I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived. And that is the most important topic on earth: peace. What kind of peace do I mean, and what kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I'm talking about genuine peace. The kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, and the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women, not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time, close quote. One would think that President Kennedy was alluding to certain passages of the Old Testament texts, or maybe even some stuff in Rome's history of its great nation. Only there's no reference to Israel or Israel's God. There's a reference to America. Whatever the case, either isolationist or imperialist, what has never changed is the feeling, the sense that we Americans all get, that despite our ups and downs, something special is going on with this great country of ours. wars fought and won, great freedoms secured, peace among all 50 states, technological and scientific advancement unparalleled, patriotism unmatched, and above all, this is really important, sudden providential events that have occurred that are seemingly out of our own grasp. What are the chances that this or that would happen in the way that it did, without any human notice, but worked into the fabric of history by God himself? Question mark. Who is pulling the strings behind the scenes? A strong sense of a divine-like calling, never mind which gods or how many gods there are, ripples before our eyes with every fresh burst of wind that waves itself across the stars and stripes of our nation's flag. July 4th was more than the birth of a nation. It was, as the American founders told us it was, the birth of a whole new age, a novus ordo secularum. We are told still today that America is destined to be the leader of the free world, to bring peace among all the nations on earth, either by example or by force or indirectly through supply of rockets and missiles to Ukraine. American exceptionalism is destined to unfurl itself across the distant lands and, by the way, maybe even galaxies, lest we forget. Although articles have been written signaling the end of the Pax Americana, like one written in 2012 by Christopher Lane entitled The End of the Pax Americana, How Western Decline Became Inevitable, there is still the story itself, calling Americans to fulfill its manifest destiny, to be a city set on a hill, ushering in the destiny that was once, here it is, Roman. Since Pax Americana was just that, a recycling of the Pax Romana, which was the claim made by Rome to establish peace throughout the world, and that was their destiny that the gods had given them. The gods had sanctioned it, and the Roman people believed it. And more importantly of all, for our purposes here, all the Jews living in and throughout the empire felt it. To hear all this today, think about what you just felt like listening to that. It's to say, I know what this feels like. I know what this looks like, American exceptionalism. I can see it with my very own eyes. My Twitter feed, my group messages, my daily conversations, the everyday politicians debating and preaching and suing and scheming. I know this from my network of friends and the articles I read. America, there's something going on. What has just been described about America, I know it. I know it very well. Hardly a day goes by when I don't think about these things, that I live in the greatest nation on earth and that there is a great responsibility thrust upon us as Americans to fulfill our destiny and to expand the Pax Americana. It consumes our life, does it not? We go to Mass on Sunday and then we go and watch Fox or CNN or whatever, and then we hear about wars going on and how aircraft carriers are moved and armies retreat. It consumes our life and makes us think that this is all there is, even if at times it feels like it's slipping away. We know what this feels like. Welcome to the Roman Empire. That's the world in which Paul lived and moved and, yes, wrote his letters. Welcome to the world of empire, not of America, but we're in the 1st century. It's the Empire of Rome. To feel all this is to place oneself within a world much similar to Paul's. Americans, no less American Catholics, feel this deeply, not just as an argument. This is key. This is the sharp edge of the point that I'm making, but as it has been presented to us as a story. This is where history has taken us. And we Americans have a special, if not dominant, as well as potentially predestined, perhaps, role to play within that story. And yet, while all of this is felt with real force, American Catholics have something pressing them from behind, sort of like, nudging their shoulder, moving them a bit forward to take a look a bit higher, to step around the corner, to see things from yet another story lurking in the background. There is, yes, this one story of America that seems to sort of press us on all sides. And yet there's the story of Jesus, the story of the church's mission, of the Creator's plan to rescue his creation in Christ. When faced with both of these stories, the picture we get of ourselves, no less of the world itself, is not entirely unlike that of Paul. These two stories sort of rage within us. Imagine now a person 2,000 years later trying to grasp the world in which we are living in today. What are these people on this Zoom call, what are they thinking about the world? What made them feel the things they felt, or the things they were saying about making America great again? What did they mean by again? And what do they mean by great? When was it great before? What story were these Americans telling themselves about America's past? And what kinds of things would you, living 20 centuries later, think are really important to these people? Okay. Would these, hypothetical future journalists feel, looking back at us living today, would they feel such needs as to research the name Donald Trump? Would they, should they know about such persons as, say, Obama, Bush, Clinton, or Reagan? Would they even have to know such names reaching as far back as Jefferson or Hamilton? Did Americans living in the 2020s have those names readily on their minds and hearts? Looking back all these centuries later, this is a future date, still hypothetical, July 4th seems to be an important day for these ancient Americans living in the 2020s, as our archaeological digs suggest. Would they need, would we need to know, would these future journalists need to know about the importance and the history of this exact date, July 4th? What exactly happens on July 4th anyway? And does it really even matter for understanding the American people living such a long, long time ago in the 2020s? The name King George II turned up as well. What was he all about? Maybe we can't say much about any of these names because we've lost all the host servers. They didn't print out articles anymore. They stopped printing books even. Everything was digital, and all the servers crashed. So they lost everything. But the bit that they do have from that person who was, keeping hard copies of everything in their house, but the bit we do have is useful in some ways in imagining the world these 21st century Americans thought they were living within. And they're talking about us here. This is a hypothetical. This is our task as Catholics, as historians, to piece together what we do have and to imagine a world in which Donald Trump and Joe Biden played the roles they played in the minds and hearts of Americans who were telling themselves a particular story about how the world worked, where history was going, and America's role within that history. All of this is to say, this is not unlike the task we have in reconstructing the world in which Paul's first century letter to the Ephesians makes the sense it does. We study history to know what words and phrases meant and what it felt like to say such things in the world in which they were first used. When Paul called God the Father of us all, or when he called Jesus Lord over all, or when he spoke of peace of Christ in the church of Christ, what kind of reactions would citizens living in and around Ephesus have to such statements? Okay, moving on. The importance of Paul's letter to the Ephesians. That's our task, okay? Paul's letter to the Ephesians comes to us after Paul's dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus to persecute the church of Christ. Although he was for sure immersed in the world that was Rome, he was also thoroughly Jewish. And so he went about, as you guys know, killing the first Catholics. He was a Pharisee intent on upholding the traditions of his elders. There's much that we could say about the Pharisaic tradition. We can't get to it in this class. We'll talk a little bit about it as we make our way through. Suffice to say, he read thoroughly the Torah and the prophets and believed deeply in the story as he and his teachers were reading it. After the encounter with Jesus, his visit with the Pope, that's Peter, and his few years in Arabia, reworking his own reading of the story in light of Jesus, the new puzzle piece, the central puzzle piece now, he took up the task the Lord had set out for him: explain the story of the Bible to the church and to the world. The importance of Paul's letter to the Ephesians is this. If you're taking notes, here you go. It is a letter that comes near the end of his life, near the end of a very long ministry in which he has had a few decades to put all the pieces together and lay them out for the early church. Ephesians is written to a people who have all these puzzle pieces from years past, given more or less by Paul and his other disciples, working with them and ministering them for almost 3 years. What we find Paul sending them in this letter is nothing less than, you guessed it, the box. The box, the big picture. By saying such things as he says, as we'll read, he says things like, I am going to unveil for you the mystery hidden from all ages, not made known to the various prophets of old from the... He is basically telling us, to keep up with the analogy, he's laying out what it looks like when the border is complete and we look up once more at the picture on the box. Now, with all that being said, let's dive into chapter 1, verse 1 to build out the border. Okay? Paul, chapter 1, verse 1, first word. Paul. Much of what we have already said summarizes all that is contained in the first word of this letter. The name Paul is not an empty word. It carries with it all that was already known about the story of this man, everything he had gone through, most of what he had thought about, and more importantly, the shape of his prayer and imprisonment. It was cruciform, you guys, from the very beginning to the very end. Those in Ephesus received this letter with all of this in mind about this man, not least in their hearts. The papyrus of this exact correspondence that was delivered to them was no doubt dripping with Paul's own blood. And since blood, also his death, a death to himself that he will speak about again and again in this letter and several others. The old man of Ephesians 4 died. He's gone. And it has brought about nothing other than the sending forth of the new man. And thus, Paul consistently identifies himself, as we see in the second word, or series of words, of the first verse. Paul, an apostle. An apostle. Apostle means someone who is sent. It's hard to imagine all that would be entailed in this kind of identity, especially for 21st century Western interpreters whose entire existence is characterized by consumption and sitting and waiting to be served. We sit so often to just be entertained. We take so often to consume whatever package or meal has been brought to our door. But to imagine, think about this, to imagine living and breathing, texting and talking as if one were always sent, the one who is sent, to say one's name and to always follow it up, as Paul does, with the one who is sent, the apostle, an apostle. Paul was an apostle. Clearly, this is not some ordinary man, but someone infused with a new identity and purpose that if we want to understand Ephesians, we need to capture. It was a purpose and an identity summed up in the very next words, Christ Jesus. The bump sustained by Paul's head on that day to Damascus sustained him for the whole rest of his life. It never left him. It never betrayed him. It always made itself felt in all of Paul's thinking and in all of Paul's doing. Many years after Paul's letter to Ephesus, Jesus will exhort the Ephesians in the book of Revelation to remember the love they had at first. You can check that out in Revelation 2, that same church that Paul's writing to. Paul's not like them in this way. Paul's love, this first experience of Christ's love, never left him. It always sent him forth as an apostle, but more importantly, as Paul of Tarsus. Much of Paul's theology, we can gather, comes right out of that first encounter. I remember when I reverted back to the Catholic Church at the end of my freshman year, I was just telling the story to people last night. It's a detailed story, but long story short, when I finally came back and visited that first mass that I hadn't gone to mass in over a year since Catholic high school. We had mass once a month. And sitting back in that back pew at Our Lady of Mount Carmel in Santa Barbara, Montecito, I was at school at Westmont, and looking up when that priest held up the host for that first time, when I really believed the grace was infused. In that moment, I knew everything was changed. That was that first moment for me. It still has never left me. It still sustains me. And Paul and Jesus' exhortation to the church in Ephesus, he says, you lost the love you had at first. Go back to that moment. You know, I have a picture of that where I was sitting, that view at Our Lady of Mount Carmel, to remind myself the love that I had at first, that first moment. This is what always sustained Paul, this first moment of grace. But Paul would remind himself of that, but also Paul from Tarsus, Paul of Tarsus. He's a Jew. And so we wouldn't just expect him to recall Jesus Christ. Paul's opening verse could hardly be without an evocation of Israel's scriptures for the present moment. The people in Ephesus are not just any kind of people, any specific or non-specific group living in Ephesus. They are more precisely the holy people of Daniel's oracles. That's important. They are, with and in Jesus, the fulfillment of the story so far. And here in verse 1, Paul's point is enough to shock modern readers from their slumbers, and it's the dreams that political neutrality is just that, neutral. Paul's allusion to the holy ones here in verse 1 is an allusion to Daniel 7, which cuts sharply across such notions, as its use here in verse 1 reveals that for Paul, the people in Ephesus are not the followers of Locke or Hobbes or George Washington, but they are the people referred to by the prophet Daniel as those who take over the world and rule it on God's behalf, the people to whom the kingdom's been given. There is some ambiguity as to what Daniel meant by the holy ones. Was he referring to angels, like in the Wisdom of Solomon, or to humans, like in other parts of the Wisdom of Solomon, or in 3 Maccabees? Whatever the case, we do know how Paul read these texts and how he saw its fulfillment in the Catholics in and around Ephesus, not least throughout the empire, the empire and the entire world. But it's not enough. I have to insist to point all this out without then returning to Daniel himself. What did Daniel, in fact, mean by the holy ones, you guys? So that, in turn, we might understand what Paul meant. Everything we know about Paul, here's a point for your notebooks. Everything we know about Paul, all the evidence we have about his way of thinking, his manner of living, it all points us in this exact direction. We would hardly expect a man so soaked in Israel's story, in the story of Israel, in the Old Testament, and the details of that story, to pull forward in time a passage here or there without bringing everything else with it. If he refers to the holy ones of Daniel 7, then the surrounding chapters are all coming with it. And therefore, before we even begin to move past verse 1, we need to address the story of Daniel. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, says Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem, just like Hamas is trying to do right now, and besieged it. Chapter 1, without the Hamas part, chapter 1, verse 1. Thus begins the oracles of Daniel, and thus the context of Paul's letter to the Ephesians. The stage is set for us in 2 Kings 24. Go check it out if you have some time, where we have the description of the king of Babylon invading Judah and destroying it. Now, no one is surprised by this. The prophets had warned that the day would come when Judah would be exiled for her unfaithfulness. All of this happens, 2 Kings 24:2 says, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke to his servants, the prophets. The reason for Babylon's invasion is perfectly clear. Read verse 4, 2 Kings 24:4. Quote, surely this came upon Judah at the command of the Lord to remove them out of his sight for the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he had done, and also for the innocent blood that he had shed. For he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord would not pardon. Close quote. Among these first exiles to Babylon was Daniel and his his three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or you know them by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The story then picks up in chapter 2, when in the second year of his reign, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. This is a classic story. I'm assuming you guys know it, especially if you have little kids that watch VeggieTales. The king dreamt of a massive statue made of 4 types of metal. The head was made of pure gold, the chest and arms of silver, the belly and thighs of bronze, and the feet partly of iron and partly of clay. Go check it out in Daniel 2. What Nebuchadnezzar would see next helps us set the stage for Paul's opening identity marker for Catholics in Ephesus. The king sees the statue and then notices a rock. A rock was cut out. But then the text says, not cut out, not by any human hands. Interesting little bit. We'll get back to it. This rock then struck the feet of iron and clay. The destruction of the feet by the rock caused the entire statue to collapse, the bronze thighs, the silver arms, and the gold head. When the various metals hit the ground, they became chaff on the threshing floor in the summer months, where wind was seen by the king as blowing them away, leaving no trace of what was formerly 4 types of metal. What was left, however, was the rock that struck the statue. As Nebuchadnezzar looked, there it was. But then the rock began to grow into what became a huge mountain that filled not just Babylon, not just Israel, but all land everywhere. It filled the whole earth. Because no wise man could tell him the dream, Nebuchadnezzar did not trust any of them with the interpretation. Only when Daniel arrives before the king as a man among the exiles of Judah, super important, to describe the content of the dream, does Nebuchadnezzar trust this particular wise man, Daniel, with the interpretation. Daniel explains to Nebuchadnezzar that he, the king of Babylon, is the head of pure gold. But Babylon will itself give way to 3 more successive kingdoms. Finally, the rock that destroyed and replaced the 4th kingdom was cut out with no human hands, we find out, precisely because, guess what? It's God's own kingdom, one which will never be destroyed. The allusions here to 2 Samuel 7 should not be missed. Shocked by Daniel's accurate description of the dream, the king couldn't help but assent to his interpretation. More than that, Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and confessed, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings, and," jot this down in your notebook, "a revealer of mysteries. For you were able to reveal this mystery." We'll come back to that in the weeks to come. Close quote. Close quote. We'll come back to that in the weeks to come. Because Daniel's wisdom, that's really important. If you were taking notes, you would put Daniel chapter 2, and then you'd highlight the words wisdom, and you'd highlight the words mystery. Because Daniel's wisdom, we'll come back to that all important word later, allowed him to properly interpret the unfolding of history, He was therefore placed in charge of all the wise men in the land, made ruler over the province of Babylon. But more than this, he was given many lavish gifts. Chapter 2, 48 through 49. Now, before we move on, we should notice several key words and phrases that ought to pique our interest as interpreters of Ephesians. What is it? What is it? What is it? More than Daniel's eventual description of the holy ones, already the very fact that Paul uses words like, pairs up words like wisdom and mystery in Ephesians 3 with concepts such as the distribution of gifts by the king to those, the church, who unveil the mystery in Ephesians 4 should give considerable pause to all of us out there that are thinking we can just skim over these chapters real fast. Paul's intention, again, I stress this, Paul's intention is hardly to cite a verse here or there from Daniel. It is instead to unfurl those oracles, the oracles of Daniel, and the story that belonged to them, which we'll talk about. There's a broader story there, across every verse of this letter to the Ephesians. So, like the marketing that, Dave, like we were doing, Church Militant. If you don't understand Ephesians, you don't understand the Bible. You guys probably heard that a bunch from me in the promo videos and stuff. The point is, if you don't understand Daniel, you don't understand Ephesians, and therefore you don't understand the Bible. And as we're going to see here in the next chapter, Paul's going to say, if you don't understand Genesis chapter 12, 15 through 22, along with Genesis 11 that pairs up with Genesis chapter 3, then you don't understand 2 Samuel 7. If you don't understand 2 Samuel 7, then you can't understand Daniel. If you don't understand Daniel, you can't understand Ephesians. If you don't understand Ephesians, you don't understand the Bible. In other words, it's all connected. Okay. But, that's too long for a promo video. But the point is all of this goes together. Now, this brings us back to Paul's letter to the Ephesians. By designating those Catholics in Ephesus as the holy ones of Daniel's vision, we are immediately thrust back to Daniel chapter 7, in which this time it's Daniel himself who had the dream. Daniel's night vision consists of 4 great beasts arriving out of the sea. Go to Daniel 7 to see it for yourself. These beasts, like the 4 types of metals in the king's dream, are 4 kingdoms. The 4th beast was significantly different in that it was more terrifying than the others and had several horns which on its head, which made war against the holy ones. But Daniel looked up as his night vision proceeded, and he saw thrones, plural, placed in heaven. One of those seats was made of fiery flames and had burning wheels, which the Ancient of Days sat upon. 1,000,000 served him, while 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. Before the throne sat a court in judgment over the kings. This is all going to be important. Before the throne sat a court in judgment over the kings and governments of the world, whose deeds were read as the books were opened. So 1 Kings 14, you also see other places in the Old Testament and the extra biblical literature in which these books that are being read are books of the deeds of kings, right? The book of Chronicles recording the deeds of the kings. This cosmic international court then stripped away the dominion possessed by the beastly kingdom. It's like the heavenly United Nations or something, some high court above the land, right? This cosmic international court then stripped away the dominion possessed by the beastly kingdoms, even as they were prolonged for a season and a time, verse 12 tells us. Having been judged by the high supreme court to be oppressive and unjust, these kingdoms will be, you guessed it, overthrown. But while this 4th kingdom was prolonged for a season, Daniel sees something strange in the high distance. Verse 13 through 14, if you want to read it with me. I saw in my night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man, and he came to the ancient. No, Chris, not what Jesus was saying. Read what Daniel was saying. I am reading what Daniel was saying, but that's what Jesus said. Exactly. I saw in my night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven. This is the verse that Jesus uses at his trial. There came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion, again, I'm not saying this is Daniel saying this. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed, close quote. Basically a good summary of what the Cristeros martyrs in Mexico were basically trying to say. These two, with their own blood, not just by what they were saying. These two verses are not just important for important sort of contextual reminders for a few of Paul's points in a few of his letters from prison. No, rather, this is the shape of the Paschal mystery itself, given to us in the four Gospels. It was, once again, this exact verse that Jesus deploys when he is put on trial and charged with blasphemy. Are you the Ancient of Days? You're looking at him. When the high priest demanded that Jesus tell him and the other court officials present if he really is the Christ, the Son of God, it was not some vague answer given by Jesus, nor was it a general reference or allusion to some series of verses alluding, basically amounting to a genuine yes. It was instead Daniel 7, verse 13. This was the text that Jesus cites at the most critical moment of his life, which would seal his immediate fate. You have said so, says Jesus. But I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. 26:64. Of course, it's not just Jesus who knows what he is doing by evoking this text, but the high priest as well. The more serious question is, do we as interpreters understand not just what he's citing, but the implications? The high priest knows Jesus is citing Daniel 7, and he knows all that it entails, even if we don't. They didn't capture any man from the dark of night, you guys, nor did they merely wake up a few, court officials from mid-REM sleep. They just put the Ancient of Days on trial. That's at least what Jesus is telling them, which is why it's hard to miss the parallel of everything that comes next. Jesus is arrested, put on trial, executed, descends into the dark prison of death, and is raised and justified by God and ascends into heaven to sit at God's right hand. Is there still any doubt as to the general shape this story takes? It is, put simply, the shape of Daniel's own arrest, his descent into the lion's den, the dark prison, and eventual ascension to the right hand of the king of Babylon throughout all the land, which is itself, we might add, the general shape of Joseph's own story, sold for silver, imprisoned in darkness, elevated to the right hand of Pharaoh over the entire land and kingdom of Egypt. To say, well, Jesus received something far better and more heavenly, a more heavenly kingdom that's not itself earthly at all. Remember, Chris, we live in America, liberalism, political neutrality. It would be correct. I mean, you could say that and depoliticize all these texts if Jesus didn't say what he did when he came back from the dead, which is that all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to him. So yes, it includes more, but it doesn't include less. Still less should there be any confusion as to these words of Jesus in Matthew 28:18. All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. They bring to completion what he confessed to the Jewish high priest at his arrest. Nor is it a coincidence that Daniel 7:14, quote, and to him was given dominion and glory and kingdoms that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him, links up quite well with the very next words of Jesus in Matthew 28:19, when Jesus commissions his disciples as ambassadors with these words, the very next verse, go therefore, that is because all authority has been given to him, as Daniel's oracle said it would, and make disciples of all nations. While Pentecost clearly captures the language and people fulfillment, Jesus stresses here that his ambassadors are to go to the nations, to the governments of the world, to the thing we call Congress, Senate, Caesar. Go tell Caesar what's up. Quite literally, me, Jesus, sitting on the throne, Daniel saw at the right hand of the Ancient of Days. Paul's very appeal to Caesar, which got him in the situation of the Roman imprisonment in which he writes this letter, is itself a gathering together of all these various texts. He's not just sitting in a Roman imprisonment writing to the church in Ephesus because Daniel said something. He's writing it because the God of Israel is bringing it to fulfillment. Paul didn't just write about these fulfillments, you guys. He fulfilled the fulfillments, most especially through his appeal to go to Caesar with his arrest. Paul's citizenship would come in hand after Paul's Roman citizenship would come in hand after all. Paul had no final interest in talking about his general case and whatever particular charges that were being leveled against him. He instead merely recognized, with the wisdom he mentions in this letter, with the wisdom the prophet Daniel said he would have, to interpret these charges within the gradual unfolding of the final kingdom in history. We now call it the Catholic Church, which Paul believed was happening in his own time. Not something seen in a dream, but in the reality of the here and now. The dream is true, and the interpretation is sure, as Daniel said. But the reality of it all for Paul was Christ and the church. To Caesar he must go so that he can stand before the king of the fourth kingdom to explain the outworking of Daniel 7 and its fulfillment in Jesus. And not just in Jesus, but in Jesus' passion, death, resurrection, and the most important feast of all that is the most forgotten, the ascension. Paul was undoubtedly closer to his goal of fulfillment, as is evidenced by a letter written later to the Philippians from this same Roman imprisonment. He writes this letter during, he's writing the letter to the Ephesians. Go to Philippians chapter 4, verses 21 through 22. Read it. Quote, "The brethren who are with me greet you. All the saints greet you, especially now those of Caesar's household." Philippians 4, 21 through 22. Wink, wink, especially now those of Caesar's household. Why add the Greek malistade? Why especially now? What does Paul mean to suggest by that? Paul says that the holy ones from Daniel's vision greet him, but he adds the adverb especially to those who are now in Caesar's household. Why would Caesar's household be given such significance here? One can't help but imagine Paul reading into these events a further indication that Daniel's story, believe it or not, is actually coming true. What are the chances that Joseph or Daniel would have been elevated to Pharaoh's and the king of Babylon's household? Does Paul have any idea that he is mapping out a further instantiation of these very stories by converting Caesar's household? Of course. If you don't know Paul, then you say no. If you know who Paul was, you say, of course he knows. One could even go further and speculate that the very next verse about the gift of the Lord Jesus is not itself a reference to the bestowal of gifts on Daniel as he is elevated. If ever a signal flare there was, you guys, this is it. This letter to the Philippians evidences exactly Paul's mission in Rome and what he spent his time and energy on: the conversion of the Roman Imperium, of Caesar's household, of Caesar himself, and thus of the known world of all the nations. Welcome to the story of the Bible. These holy ones or saints in Caesar's household are also in chapter 1, verse 1 of Ephesians, you guys. These saints are not just super nice people. They are political people, people set apart, as Daniel says they are, to sit upon thrones in the heavenly places with the Son of Man. They're what today we call Catholics. Next section, who are at Ephesus and faithful, or in Ephesus. all of this brings us to the city of Ephesus itself, still in verse 1. And although your Bible might not include the words in Ephesus, some of you might have it or some of you might not, depending on which translation you're reading. Typically, it's tacked on to the holy ones who are also faithful, who are in Ephesus in verse 1. We should note that many ancient manuscripts do not use those words, specifically marking out the Ephesians as the direct recipients of this letter. But because our most ancient manuscripts do not include that, we have scholars that basically go back and forth as to whether Paul wrote this as a letter directly to them or a letter meant to be circulated throughout the region of Asia Minor. So there are all sorts of reasons to think that although this letter was indeed circulated, if it wasn't circulated, how did we get it? It was written more directly to the church in Ephesus. But rather than jump forward to those texts that indicate as much, I'll prove it to you that I think that it was written to Ephesus. Many of my Catholic scholarly friends aren't sure. Some of them don't think it is. I think it is, and I'll try to prove it to you as we work through. But rather than jump forward to those texts that indicate as much, only to go back to these texts, then back again to work through those exact same texts later on, as most commentaries do, when you do that, you kind of get like this, like jerkiness, like it's interpretive whiplash. Instead, what we'll do, you guys, is we'll pick up that evidence as it comes to us, okay? For now, let's just review a bit of what we know about Paul in Ephesus, and we're going to wrap up here. And remember, put in your question, start thinking about questions. The last about 5 minutes. Ephesians and Paul. Okay, now I want you to imagine something else. Imagine that you were hired by Paul to be part of his dicastery for the propagation of the faith or something like that. And as part of Paul's inner circle, you are one of the few friends of his that he calls upon to sit down and map out his missionary journey. Paul is a big thinker, and you already know this going into the meeting, namely that he wants to take the gospel to the ends of the world. So you sit down with Paul and the others, and after you say your prayer to begin the meeting, someone starts by asking, okay, boys, what are the 3 cities we need to hit first? There are passages in the oracles of the prophet Isaiah that will force Paul to head to Spain. Can talk about that. Actually, those ancient Isaiah oracles, I think, are actually fulfilled in the conversion of California, but we'll talk about that later because Spain will eventually take it. But we can't talk about those texts right now. But before that can happen, before Paul can go to Spain, the farthest west that he knows of, Paul and his companions will need a Western base from which to launch such a trip. But these passages notwithstanding from Isaiah, let's ask ourselves, what are the 3 most influential cities in the world, in the Roman Empire? Well, here are the top 3. Rome, number 1, Athens coming in 2nd, and you guessed it, Ephesus, number 3. If Paul wanted to evangelize Asia Minor, from which he might eventually have to have a place to travel, to launch from, to go to Rome and then to Spain, he would need to plant an archdiocese in Ephesus, okay? Which there were already Christians there. He's building on it. The Romans themselves planted Ephesus as the senatorial province of all Asia Minor, a key stronghold from which it was necessary for Rome to spread its gospel of peace to the east. Paul countered by swooping right under the nose of this exact city, establishing and strengthening a Catholic archdiocese from which the Pax Christi would come from the east and travel west. But the evidence we have shows that these were hardly 2 ships, 2 Pax Christi, Pax Romana ships sailing in the night. Both gospels of peace would not only notice one another, but come crashing headlong into their particular announcements and respective interests with Paul's ministry in Ephesus. Acts 19, go to Acts 19:38, is just one instance in which the proconsul of Rome in Ephesus links eyes with the proconsul of Christ in Ephesus, that is Paul. And these were not just 2 messages of peace, but these were kind of like 2 forms of government, since the word church readily conjured up the idea of a civic assembly in ancient Greece. I know that makes people uncomfortable thinking of the church as a political body, but nevertheless, it is. Acts 19 affords us the opportunity to review Paul's ministry, to view Paul's ministry in Ephesus years before his letter was written. Paul knew this community? Yes, he did. He lived there for almost 3 years. While Apollos was at Corinth, Acts 19, let's read it. While Apollos was at Corinth, Paul passed through the upper country and came to Ephesus, arguing and pleading about the kingdom of God, says Luke in Acts 19, verse 1, and then skip down to verse 8. Since the Jewish synagogue was having none of it, as you'll see, Paul went every single day to the hall of Tyrannus instead. Now, if by hall of Tyrannus, Luke means the lecture hall of a philosopher named Tyrannus, rather than say the landlord who owns the property, then Paul could be renting the space in the afternoons and present, because the lectures typically ended at 11 a.m. Philosophers, go in, give your lecture, and then it ended at 11. So Paul's probably renting it out around 11:30 noon, maybe after lunch or whatever. And he's presenting himself. He could be presenting himself and the story of Israel and Israel's Messiah as a kind of philosophy thing. Either way, the kind of people who showed up to these sorts of things were the kinds of people Paul was interested in pleading his case and eager to persuade into believing that the kingdom of David has arrived in the kingdom of Christ, in the church. And as Luke tells us Paul did, when you show up daily for 2 straight years, it's not at all surprising what we read in Acts 19 in verse 10, quote, that all the residents of Asia heard the word of the Lord, both Jews and Greeks. Okay. There is good reason to think, as we'll see, that Paul really was, as Luke tells us he was, having to cast out an extraordinary amount of demons from people's lives. We read that in verses 11 through 13. There's also good reason to laugh at the attempt by the sons of Sceva, who were mere unbelieving laymen, attempting to do the same, to cast out demons, but instead they get beat up by a demoniac. Since, as the demon says, the demons know neither. The demons say that the sons of Sceva are neither Jesus nor his local ordinary, Paul, right? The bishop. So A for effort, but F for faithlessness. But where was all of this extraordinary amount of evil coming from in Ephesus? Were they playing too many video games or buying too many Ouija boards or, forgot to forgive a neighbor or two? Verse 19 records for us the famous scene of the many people of Ephesus becoming Catholic, a contingent of which divulged the answer and confessed their collusion with the dark arts themselves. There it is. They brought out their magic books and burned them, probably at the insistence of Paul, who must have given them the old man versus new man lecture, that he's going to talk about later in this letter, and he talks about in his other letters. The old man has died, so burn the books and get on with living under the sovereign reign of Christ's love and forgiveness. Paul was successful in all of this, but that was also the problem. If they are burning magic books, then, as the catalog of ancient inscriptions of Artemis strongly suggests, we have a whole catalog of this, the people were increasingly turning away from the local goddess, which is Artemis of the Ephesians, who was ordering the practice of the dark arts. Okay, so we're going to stop there, and we'll talk about Artemis. We'll pick up next class about Artemis of the Ephesians.